You can support this project by subscribing on Spotify for £3 a month.
Welcome to the Nostalgia Podcast with me, Sebastian Morello, my co-host, Brian Scarf, and this week we're joined by my good friend, Mary Harrington. Hello, Mary.
Hi.
Nice to have you with us. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Mary Harrington will be known to our listeners as a frequent writer, columnist at Unheard, and the author of a book which I really cannot recommend highly enough, the Feminism Against Progress, for which you have come to be known as the reactionary feminist, or perhaps that came beforehand. I'm not quite sure which way around.
It did. The causality was completely the other way around. It's probably the fault of that phrase that I ended up writing the book, in the sense that I had a very lengthy argument via Twitter direct message with somebody who slid into my DMs just to inform me that I should not just call myself a post-liberal feminist, that in fact I should describe myself as reactionary because reasons. And I said, I'm sorry, what? Who are you? And why are you? And then we had this very, very protracted argument. It took months. And eventually I conceded the point and changed my Twitter bio just to see how long it would take him to notice to reactionary feminist. It took him about 3 days, I think. But in the meantime, Matthew Schmitz, who was then at First Things, wrote to me to say this is an arresting turn of phrase. Would you like to write something for First Things and explain what you mean by it? Then I had to figure out what I meant by it, because it was just up until that point it was just a meme. And that article, which is still, I think it's just called Reactionary Feminism. It was probably the first bash I made at coining the phrase. Which I've actually seen in the wild since. I've seen it on other people's Twitter bios, which is mad.
Catching on. You've actually started a movement then.
It's a thing. It's a wave of feminism after a fashion. I mean, it might be sort of microwave, a ripple, maybe, but it's a thing. Which was unexpected.
I wanted initially to ask you couple of questions about the Trump ascendancy, round two, and no doubt Brian will have his own line of inquiry, but then actually you've covered a lot of this in a very interesting discussion with James Orr, Peter Hitchens and Aaron Bastani at the Unheard Club the other day. And actually, I want to ask you something which I think is much more interesting and probably pertains to your expertise a little bit more, which is this so-called vibe shift, this international shift to the right. Because of my general metaphysical and religious commitments, I'm worried that this might very well turn out to be just a shift from liberal progressivist materialism to right-wing materialism, and it concerns me that a lot of the people who are particularly excited by the Trump ascendancy also have for years been talking about, DNA and ethnic categories and skull size and all of these things that can take you down some quite unwholesome rabbit holes. And this notion that that it might be a shift to just another species of materialism seems to me to be supported by this strange alliance of the right with kind of Silicon Valley transhumanists. So anyway, given that you have lethally and devastatingly diagnosed the rise of the transhumanist epoch, I wanted to hear your thoughts on all of that.
I mean, I think everything that you just said is right. There's a lot of jubilation at the moment at having escaped DEI and a certain kind of a war on form of all kinds. But I think it's a great deal too soon to be celebrating any kind of an escape from spreadsheet brain. I mean, if you could think of DEI as a sort of subset of spreadsheet brain, in the sense of, when I say, to explain what if it's not obvious what I mean by that, I mean the sort of mindset that imagines everything can be put neatly into sort of Microsoft Excel format, tabulated and taxonomized and pivot tabled and analyzed as discrete units of reality. The world is sort of ultimately manipulable and controllable in that fashion. I mean, that's a sort of, it's very much the kind of underlying impulse behind DEI, which sort of tries to kind of find a spreadsheet format for the infinite variety of human beings, for our different kinds of humanness, if you like, and turn them into spreadsheetable, analyzable categories, and somehow manages to overlook humanness as such in the process. And people correctly identify there's something anti-human and dehumanizing about that as a mode of governance and a mode of trying to do the social fabric, and that it has incredibly counterproductive effects, no matter how overtly well-intentioned the driving motives behind it. Doing diversity as a set of spreadsheet categories inevitably degrades into something very dehumanizing. So people are correct to celebrate the end of that, but I don't think it in any way signals the end of spreadsheet brain. I mean, I think as you alluded to in your question, to me, there's barely a fag paper between the sort of the DEI version of spreadsheet brain and the race science version of spreadsheet brain. To me, they seem like variations on a theme. If you're sort of tabulating people, according to their precise genetic codes or subcodes, or measuring their crania and tabulating average IQ levels and all these various metrics that the nerds obsess about. I struggle. It sort of feels like a different way of doing DEI. Perhaps with a different set of motives. Maybe the more interesting question is, what vision of the good, what visions of the good, respectively, are DEI and race science ordered to, such that they both apply spreadsheet brain to potentially quite different outcomes. I think that's probably a more interesting meta question to explore. Because I actually don't think it's adequate to say, oh, these are just spreadsheet brain and therefore bad. There are metaphysical differences between them. And I think the difference probably lies in the telos, but that's not something I've thought about. I'm nervous about spitballing, particularly on something as radioactive as race science, which is, to be clear, is not a worldview I espouse.
No, sure.
But even spitballing about that in a podcast feels risky to me to the extreme. I wonder what you think about. Yeah, I mean, what are the metaphysical what are the two teloses that DEI and the other DEI are ordered to? What do you think about that?
I mean, certainly I agree with you that the reduction of human nature to nothing other than a taxonomy within the animal kingdom that belongs to a certain kind of uniting of liberal and Darwinian themes, and the reduction of human nature to mechanism that you get in late modern progressivism essentially amount to the same thing. Whether you want to see processes in the brain determining all of our behavior through a mechanistic metaphor or through an organic metaphor, it amounts to the same thing, which is essentially, the collapse of free will, the collapse of moral responsibility, the fact that we might have spiritual and religious aspirations, or that we are creative in a way that animals are. All of these things get kind of disintegrated and collapsed, and they get seen purely through the prism of use and utility and advantage and the trampling of weaker people and all of that sort of thing. And it seems to me, and perhaps we're going to get here a little too quickly and we need to step back, but it seems to me that the way out, and the only way out, is something like a spiritual renewal, that takes us out of these strictly materialist categories. But then, of course, I know that you are very much committed to diagnosing things in a way that privileges material conditions, and so I'm extremely sympathetic to that, because I don't think we should ever treat religious commitments or the notion of the spiritual aspirations of human beings as just kind of gold dust that you sprinkle on every situation and it solves everything. So anyway,
I mean, as it happens, I'm actually very optimistic on the spiritual renewal. And although I share your nervousness about the rise of the tech right and the right wing progressives, it's something I've been thinking about a lot at the moment. I wrote three monster essays over the last quarter of last year, which all treat this from different perspectives. I wrote one for the Heritage Foundation called Imago DEI, which I think you've read, diagnosing the inevitable, likely failure of any attempt, however right-wing it is in theory, to transcend human nature through technology as likely to resile eventually into a kind of grey goo leftism. Just because if you're waging war on the template for your own success, then you no longer have a metric for it, and then this is fundamentally any version of technology, however right wing, that wages war on human nature is structurally leftist without realizing it.
Sure.
That's the sort of too long didn't read, but it's quite a long paper with many more extra steps.
But where's your optimism then?
Well, I'm coming to that. It's a very qualified optimism. The second part of that was a paper which I think is coming out next month for ARC Research on information technology and the soul. They asked me to write something on identity in the digital age, and I just went down a very deep rabbit hole. I ended up all the way back in the axial age, which I come to the conclusion represents the first singularity. That was the first point of our merger with our own technologies, because the experience of developing writing as such completely reordered the way people thought in general, and in particular the way people thought about humans' inner life, about what it is to have an inner life, or even that it's possible to have an inner life. The idea of the soul seems to emerge concurrently with the technology of writing, which I find a phenomenally interesting and very provocative idea. And now I've followed various evolutions of that through the fusion of classical and Christian ideas on the relation between the soul and the divine order in medieval Christian thinking, through to the impact William of Ockham had in pulling those pieces apart. I know you'll be spitting on the ground, Sebastian, at this point, because I know you're an Ockham disrespecter. To the modern era, at which point. I think it was really my argument was that Ockham's disaggregation of, as it were, his first bash at disaggregating divine order from material reality set in motion a series of innovations which culminated in the printing press, which was the second great information revolution after the development of writing as such. The development of mass production writing kicked off a second wave of revolution, not just in what people think reality is, but also in what people think being a person is, which has gifted us after a fashion all of modernity. and all of the things that we both love and hate about modernity, including the technologies that we're talking to each other on, and all of the things about the Cartesian worldview, which I know you personally hate and despise with a passion, Sebastian. And my argument, and I told you, this is a very, very qualified optimism as a kind of medium long answer, is that we're now coming out the other side of that as a consequence of the third revolution in information technology, which is the digital age. That in a sense, the materialist paradigm exhausted itself through its own internal logic and culminated in the re-emergence of entanglement or participation or mystery, or there's a bunch of different ways of saying it, into supposedly objective reality through quantum mechanics, and which is a discovery in science which I think has yet to be fully metabolized by the culture, even though it happened over a century ago. And I think this is an extraordinary fact and an extraordinary question. Why is it that it's taken us so long to metabolize the philosophical and the metaphysical implications of quantum mechanics? Because the prevailing culture still, by and large, has behaved until really quite recently as though we still inhabit the mechanistic 19th century universe, even though the physicists concluded very convincingly more than a century ago that in fact we don't. And yet there are still children's TV programs being made that depict atoms as little separate balls that orbit around one another. It's mad. I mean, it's straight up misinformation, and it's on BBC's STEM programming for little children. It's crackers.
Right.
But nobody really knows what it is. So I'm about halfway through the long answer, which unfortunately you've just let yourself in for. So my qualified optimism is that downstream of quantum physics, we got the semiconductor. Downstream of the semiconductor, we got the digital revolution. Downstream of the digital revolution, everybody's brain is being rewired such that they're finally able to understand quantum physics. Downstream of that comes your spiritual revolution. Sorry, that was a very, very, very condensed version of what's actually quite an extended and wordy argument. But that's what I think is happening now, and that's what I think happens next. I don't think it's by any stretch of the imagination all a good thing, but that's what I think is coming next. And the final piece of that, which I think I also sent you, was the bit about the politics of occlusion. Reading Derrida against Barfield as two 20th century philosophers who are grappling in different ways with the return of participation. And just sort of fleshing out an argument I've made before about how I see post-structuralism as the correct diagnosis but the wrong prescription, which is to say, having rightly identified a metaphysical turn which has already taken place, which is the return of participation, but incorrectly concluding from that there's no truth and no reality and nothing left but power, and just sort of sending us all down this very nihilistic blind alley. In an attempt to save the empiricist appearances, basically. And that I hope is now drawing to an end, because people have come to the conclusion that it's, we're standing here in the midst of the Trumpian abolition of DEI, to be replaced by we're not quite sure what yet. And I think that's what we'll see replacing it is an interesting question in its own right. And I certainly don't think it's guaranteed to be colorblind meritocracy because I don't think it's going to be colorblind meritocracy in the classical liberal sense, because we don't live in a classical liberal reality anymore, because we have exited the print age, which was the classical liberal age. Even those classical liberals who are clinging most desperately to classical liberalism are going bananas through the effort, and just are even more insane than the people who've just embraced the insanity that we're now in.
Well, obviously, my natural pessimism wants to come in and sort of pick holes in that and
pick away.
I would at least query how exactly out of that chaos, that sort of renewal and rediscover. I suppose this is why you got me reading Wendy Wheeler and the work on symbiosis and so on. But before I do that, I'm aware that there's a running theme in this podcast, which is that, and we didn't set it up like this, but it's basically that I'm pessimistic about everything and Brian's pretty optimistic about everything. So perhaps I should bring Brian. Do you want to come in here
During this whole thing, I felt like there was a big elephant in the room that was being completely ignored, which was right at the heart of the question, which is that all of these changes, all of this vibe shift, seems to have been facilitated. This move to the right has been facilitated by the personality of Donald Trump, which shifts things away from a materialist conception and a spreadsheet brain conception where human beings are kind of interchangeable, because absolutely nobody is interchangeable with Donald Trump. Regardless of what you think of him, whether he's a good person or a bad person, he's a sheer force of personality. And his, I actually think that sort of the cult of personality that surrounds him is already a massive step away from the kind of neutral rule of law, spreadsheet brain thinking that you're worried about being the alternative to the kind of progressivism that's beginning to disappear. It's already a manifestation of a kind of spirituality where the emperor is given a quasi-divine status. And this is manifesting in kind of books being written called esoteric Trumpism and the like. But I think the fact that everything is
I just
kind
got a
of
review
rotating,
copy of that in the post this morning.
Fantastic. No, I'm looking forward. I saw that on Twitter, actually. Looking forward to you reviewing it. But it seems to me that is the conflict on the right between this old school materialist race science and just rule by personality of the emperor, which seems to be a real manifestation or the manifested in Trump. Trump is winning. So there was quite a big spat over the last few weeks about a visa program which brings in highly qualified engineers, tech engineers in particular, from places like India. And one of the senior individuals who are lining up for a position in Trump administration, Vivek Ramaswamy, came out and sort of said, look, we need more of this. This is great. Very much the interchangeable, America is an idea, not a place, not a people. So as long as we bring in as many successful individuals and sort of grow the economy, and that was sort of, there was a very strong pushback from certain sectors of the right, and within a few days, this gentleman Ramaswamy disappears almost entirely, and it becomes very clear that Trump just put a stop to it. And I see that as a very clear clash between the already stepping into the anti-materialist space of powerful personalities away from spreadsheet thinking. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yes and no. Actually, my next little project might even be the title of the next book, is The King and the Swarm, which is actually on exactly this theme. What of the relationship between political legitimacy and the digital revolution? Because it seems very plain to me that a post-atomic politics doesn't set the same stock in numerical electoral representation as the atomic one. That just seems obvious to me, and it will also likely call for a return of attention to form, of hilo as well as morphe, if you like, so to form as well as matter. Which translated into political terms means group differences as well as individual diversity, and these are, and if you translate that out of abstraction into more concrete political terms, what you're looking at there is a kind of post-democratic politics which opens space for group interests as well as potentially individual ones, and that requires new kinds of political legitimacy. I think that to me is one very plausible line of evolution for a post-atomic politics at scale, and mapping this concretely onto what we're looking at the moment. I've been thinking for a while that the left-right contest had stopped being one of economic left versus right in the sort of 20th century sense, and was more about what kind of a leader you had for your technocracy, whether you were going to be governed by a headless swarm, or whether you were going to be governed by some sort of a personalistic figure. So it was going to be either the king or the swarm. More recently, I've been asking myself whether it isn't in fact the king and the swarm, in the sense that even if you do have a sort of a more monarchic figure who represents in the more medieval metonymic sense. Stop me at any point if I'm being too abstract about any of this. Even if you have a more monarchic figure, a king in the full medieval sense, rather than the sort of Diet Coke King Charles III sense, you still, I mean, the question remains: what does his administration look like? You know, of how is his administration ordered? How is it run? Is it still a technocracy? And if not, then what? And I think it probably is. Like, realistically, you know, the amount of technocracy isn't just going to disappear overnight. You know, it might evolve over time, but short of a sort of full stack civilizational collapse, which I don't think is something I would endorse or celebrate. I think it's going to be the king and the swarm after some sort of a fashion. Just to relating that back to, I think everything you say, Brian, about Trump's sort of charismatic, irreplaceable, personalistic qualities is absolutely right. And if there's, you know, I'm ambivalent about the Trump era in many respects. You know, I'm not sure what it means for Britain at all. But one thing I do think we should all celebrate is that the world's preeminent superpower is no longer governed by a glassy-eyed golem representing we don't know what. You know, it's governed by an irreplaceable, phenomenally potent, charismatic individual. Which has rehumanized an order which was on the brink of becoming something quite frighteningly post-human. So in that sense, I think it's to be celebrated. But I think I would not too hasty to declare spreadsheet brain a thing of the past, because I think there's still going to be lots of it to be discerned in the swarm that follows in the wake of the Trumpian king, as it were.
Well, you can't just get out of at least 350 years of intense rationalism because of an election. So it seems to me that's where we're stuck. Now, in terms of it being a combination of a personality cult, tuck in. For our listeners, Mary is waving a Terry's chocolate orange in front of our faces, and knowing that we don't have one. It seems to me that, of course, in a technological or an intensely technological age like we have now, it's got to be a combination of rule by God Emperor and rule by swarm. And then the question really is, can you find the most benign figure to put in that position? I mean, this basically goes back to the old maxim that the best possible government is always that of a benign dictatorship. The trouble is that the moment someone has that amount of power, they cease to be benign. Now, we're currently in a situation in which everything we do and say is being tracked and monitored, at least potentially. We've got devices all in our pockets that are listening to everything that we say. A huge amount of information is held on every single one of us. And presumably, politics is increasingly just going to be about, do you want the person you most trust having that amount of power over each one of you? And of course, that also means that the principle of subsidiarity, the notion that, I suppose, power is arranged hierarchically and it's constantly localized, is now completely and utterly a thing of the past, purely on account of the technologies that are available to us. And so the only available options to us now are the options of a benign or a malign dictatorship.
Do I agree with that? I don't know. I sort of feel like a more pressing question than which king would we prefer is who are the king's subjects. We sometimes act as though that's just self-evident, and it really isn't. Talking about the monarch in the abstract. I mean, I think even the H1B controversy that you mentioned briefly before, Brian, really turned on the question of who are the king's subjects, and on what terms. How porous are the.
It was a step away from the king's subjects are whichever
or anybody who
unit.
turns up. Right. Yeah, exactly. But absolutely, I think the sort of pure technocracy model, in which what you just said makes sense, Sebastian, is what I think. What I've characterised in an essay not long ago as the nomos of the airport. And I mean, an airport, I think, is actually. If you're going to go down the sort of pure technocracy, sort of Vivek Ramaswamy kind of ideal world, I'm being a bit unfair to Vivek, perhaps, but if an airport is actually a pretty model polity on the replacist model of how polities should work. I mean, as an airport. I sometimes feel as though British governments have resorted to treating the entirety of the British Isles as a sort of airport-like frictionless economic zone, or governing as if that would be desirable. But the thing about airports is that they're actually quite tightly governed. They're intensely climate controlled. Who gets in and out is tightly controlled. What manner of weapons or other threatening substances or implements can get in and out is very tightly controlled. Anybody who kicks up any kind of a fuss is swiftly subdued and expelled or otherwise dealt with. And everything about an airport is an extraordinarily orderly environment. And in that context, it's possible for the people, as it were, to be completely unbounded, in the sense of just being able to flow in and out as just interchangeable units. And because everything else is so tightly and technocratically ordered, who are the king's people just doesn't really arise as a question, because you're thought of as sort of transient flow of interchangeable units just coming through. And as long as somebody is coming through, it doesn't really matter who. The moment you want an environment where there's a bit more trust or a bit more permanence or a bit, then you have to. You have to change your view on who's allowed in and who's allowed out, and how exactly to settle that view it feels a subject of very bitter controversy pretty much everywhere in the world. People either want to leave their country of origin and go somewhere where they expect is going to be nicer, or they want to, or people who are living somewhere which is perceived to be nicer want to stop everybody trying to move to wherever it is that they live. And then there are other people whose economic interest rests in there being as many cheap workers as possible, and there are others whose economic interest rests in being able to keep working class wages higher. And I mean, all of this is arguably facilitated and accelerated by the tech-enabled ease of international travel, and also the way social media exists to spread awareness of the fact that other places in the world exist and might be a nicer place to live. I mean, I've lost count of the number of conversations I've had with peers here in England who are just absolutely furious and miserable about the state of the country, and are effectively sort of browsing a kind of shop window on the internet of other places that they might live around the world. And you've got to think, is everybody doing this now? Is everybody just shopping around for where they think they might for a home where they imagine they might be able to live? And does nobody feel any attachment to their place anymore? Could be. And if that's,
it's a millionaire every 45 seconds, isn't it? A millionaire every 45 seconds leaves the country at the moment.
It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But I think but all of this really goes to the question of who are the king's subjects, because it's very difficult to settle on an answer to the question who are the king's subjects when literally everybody, whether it's sort of smartphone, whether it's a would-be migrant in Algeria or Albania or Afghanistan, or it's a would-be emigrant from the United Kingdom to Australia or Dubai, literally everybody is scrolling the countries of the world like product listings on Amazon and wondering where it would be most congenial and affordable for them to take up residence. So that in that context, in that cultural and technological milieu, I mean, how do you go about answering the question of who are the king's subjects? And if you can't, then it's very difficult to settle very clearly on a picture of what the king is either owed by those putative subjects, or conversely what the king owes to those putative subjects. And I think these are all very unsettled questions of legitimacy, which perhaps over the course of the Trumpian era we might come to see some more concrete answers to them. But I also wonder if it might be whoever it is who succeeds Trump, who starts crystallizing answers to those questions. And again, perhaps it may well be sort of second tier monarch figures. I think thinking particularly of Nayib Bukele, who's actually a very interesting case in point on a lot of these questions, because he's not a blood and soil nationalist. I mean, he can't be. He's half Palestinian. So the idea that he's some sort of Blut und Boden Salvadorian is complicated, I suppose you could say, at least by his heritage. And yet, in the sort of thinking about monarchs in the medieval sense, I was reading recently a passage in Aquinas, I forget the source, where he talks about the optimum relation between the ruler and the ruled, which he characterizes as friendship. And he has a great deal more to say about what friendship means in the context of that kind of hierarchical ordering. But he says ultimately the least worst option on the table is a friendship between the monarch and who he governs. And it's very clear if you look at the way Bukele speaks about the Salvadorian people, it's very clear that he ticks that box. In Thomist terms, there's a very clear sense that he understands himself as existing in continuity with the Salvadorian people, and he expresses a sense of responsibility to them, and as it were, a sensitivity and a desire to prioritize their interests, and to do whatever it is that he does overall in the interests of the Salvadorian common good. And yet, it is emphatically not a Blut und Boden approach. I mean, even the German makes no sense in that context, but I can't speak Spanish. It's emphatically not a blood and soil thing for all the sort of F words that get thrown at Bukele, because he also does things like offer favorable tax and relocation terms to foreign talent who might want to relocate to El Salvador and bring their skills and businesses with them. So in a sense, he's playing the migration game as well, and he's competing for high quality subjects as well, albeit with a different deck of cards to, say, Donald Trump. But everybody's competing in a sense. And so I think there's something very interesting going on there in terms of a sense of circulation of desirable individuals, but simultaneously as though it's possible to hold space for some elite circulation of peoples, and also of a sense of continuity with a people broadly considered as a static and bounded body. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes total sense, and certainly what I would say, and here's a kind of rare spasm of optimism on my part, that what I would say about Trump is he represents the return of old-fashioned oikophilia, of a kind of love for land and country, and this is even more intense in J.D. Vance. I was amazed when he gave his first address at the campaign rally, and he said, we ought not to think of America in propositional terms. We ought to think of America as, yes, we are a nation that came out of a paper constitution of listed propositions, but having done that, we're now a people. We're a settled people with a way of life and an identity. That's so far from the widely propagated conception of what it is to be an American, that anyone can just turn up, and as long as they're seeking the American dream and they'll sign up to the American Constitution and they'll say they believe in these constitutions and, you know, they'll sing at a flag or whatever it is, then they are American overnight. And actually, he is injecting a kind of old-fashioned, almost European organicism into the question of what it is to be an American that I haven't heard before. And this very much ties into what you're saying about political life as a species of friendship, because you see almost the exact opposite happening in England. In
absolutely.
You know, it's that to me is fascinating. That there's this old notion, and Aquinas talks about this in De Regno, and you know, there's a tradition of this all the way to Walter Bagehot in his distinction between the efficient and the ceremonial aspects of government. The idea that if people are not they're not loyal to the state from within, from their own passions, because they have a patriotic love of their nation, then they have to be conformed to the requirements of the state from without, namely by coercion. And as you have had years and years and years of a kind of intensifying oikophobia, a kind of hatred of home developing in the British Isles, the government has become more and more intrusive and coercive, and this turned into this sort of Leviathan juggernaut that it is now. And you know, dare I say, we might take a leaf out of what's happening in America at the moment and discover a kind of good old-fashioned patriotism and love of the landscape and love for a settled way of life and so on. And I'm not, you know, I'm not excluding the notion that people can come and sign up to that. I mean, my wife is an immigrant to this country, so is Brian's, you know, and have embraced the English way of life. And I don't think that's out of the question for someone like J.D. Vance in the United States. But it's exactly what you're describing. It's a rootedness in the land without it being a blood and soil conception of that kind of loyalty, I think.
I've been thinking a lot about this theme, particularly as it applies to Britain, and particularly as it applies to Britain's response to what's now happening across the pond in the United States. Recently, I argued that we've since the end of the empire, which was in 1945-ish. I mean, it sort of comprehensively imploded about 15 years after that. But say from the period 45 to about 1960 was really the collapse. And since 1945, we've had this. We've been keeping up this sort of hyacinth bouquet version of ourselves that's getting thinner and thinner as time goes on. You know, a little bit like those strapped for cash aristos who'd sell their property to the National Trust and then continue living in it for a peppercorn rent. Yeah. That's basically what we've been doing since the empire imploded. And we've been trying to keep together three things which are actually quite contradictory to one another, and also often internally as well. You know, we've been trying to balance being a European power, or having our near abroad, and all the complicated and sometimes unhappy relationships we've had with other European countries and peoples over the centuries. The supposed Commonwealth, which is to say, or at least originally, which was to say, those countries which in some cases we colonized and which then became independent, and then also confusingly those countries we colonized but didn't settle, and which subsequently became independent but retained their own peoples, most of whom now hate us. And all of those are supposedly one big happy family through which Britain is going to exercise soft power around the world. And so that's a second set of ways in which we've gone on sort of hyacinth bouqueting a kind of a global presence for Britain. And the third way is by piggybacking on American hard power. That's really the National Trust that we sold our stately home to. And are now paying a peppercorn rent in order to ponce around as though we still own it, where in fact we have no say over what happens to any of its grand rooms or famous paintings. And I think that all of that has to come apart if America gives up on the liberal post-war pretense of being the world's policeman. Because I think all of those, in different ways, all of those three things, the fiction of a conflict-free Europe depends on American hard power. The Commonwealth, not just all fighting one another like rats in a sack, also depends on, broadly speaking, on American hard power. It certainly isn't something we can do anything about. I mean, that was obvious in Rhodesia. A very long time ago. And many other theatres since, and the idea of the world's being the world's international policeman obviously depends on the actual international policeman wanting to do that. And it's not really something that we can do on our own. So all of those delusions just pop, they evaporate, or they become mutually internally incoherent to such a degree that we're going to have to choose.
There's every indication that Trump will move in that direction. He doesn't want to.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that means we lose our charm. Britain loses whatever it had with America. I noticed this when I was in America last year, that no one cared that I was from England. I was expecting everyone to find me terribly charming and sort of say, "Oh my God, you sound like someone out of my favorite film," or I had 4 weddings and a funeral, or whatever it was, right? And actually, absolutely nobody cared. By the third day, I was thinking about sort of, I don't know, wearing a monocle and a top hat or something, just to try and attract some attention. But nobody cared, and I realised that actually, being English has entirely lost its charm in the United States. Absolutely nobody cares. And now, I mean, my friends in America just tell me that the perception over there is that England is a complete basket case. They just think it's completely mad that people go to and serve long prison sentences for tweets, and actually, I think we've been running on the fumes of a relationship that no longer exists, and everyone's waking up to that now.
I don't know. I think the geopolitical special relationship was never real. That was all just delusion.
Sure.
I do think there are. You're overstating the case on the nobody cares. In that, I visit the US fairly regularly, and it's certainly not always the case. But it feels to me as though there are bonds of affection there which there wouldn't be with some other randomly chosen international country, some of which are to do with a measure of common language, a measure of common heritage, in some case distant, but still palpable ties of blood and culture and history and so on. We have however contestedly, we have a sort of common cultural origin to it, at least with the WASPs. I mean, it's with
right.
other parts of the overall American polity, it's a bit more of a complicated picture. But at least as regards the WASPs, there is a measure of continuity there. And I don't know. It's far from obvious that translates into any kind of special treatment. If anything, it's probably the opposite. But there's something there. I don't know. What that actually counts for in hard policy terms is anybody's guess. But I think, I welcome the end of Britain's post-war hyacinth bouquet arc. Yeah. I think it's high time. If we're going to be a small, poor European country that has to balance between different empires, then we should. I mean, Viktor Orban makes a decent fist of that.
To borrow, be honest about it.
While I'm name checking problematic international political figures, if I've dropped Bukele into the conversation, I think it would be rude not to include Orban as well, because he does all right at that. I mean, he's in an invidious position geographically speaking, because he's got China on one doorstep and he's got Brussels on the other. And he has to pedal very hard just to maintain anything like what he might understand to be protecting the interests of his people. And again, there's another example of a leader who's widely decried as, being, crypto fash or whatever, but seems to me to have a very clear sense of continuity between his interests and those of the people whom he represents.
Well, that's partly surely because he's got a discernible people.
Well, yeah, I think that definitely helps. You know, who are the king's subjects is an easier question to answer in Hungary than it is in some parts of the world. That's definitely true. And I dare say, but again, you know, we find in Hungary another example of a leader who is simultaneously protective of the cohesion of his demos overall, and is also very solicitous of brain draining international dissidents from around the world wherever he can. You know, he's always enthusiastic about, you know, if possible, encouraging people fed up by the political situation elsewhere to come and spend some time in Hungary. So there's it feels to me as though there's a sort of incipient, there's a sort of tacit open borders only for people with a certain amount of money and intelligence policy kind of emerging, you know, as a way of squaring quite a difficult set of political circles in the age of international travel
and cultural cohesion. It's not just wealthy, intelligent people going to Hungary. It's wealthy, intelligent people with a proper apprehension
who are politically aligned
culture
and are baptized.
Right. There's a serious.
There's a preference for Christians in Hungary, which is quite interesting. I suppose that leads to the notion that at least towards the tail end of the British Empire, you know, empires tend towards their latter epoch to have to come up with some moral justification for their existence, and every empire does this. And the British Empire, which largely arose through incremental trading agreements, later came up with this idea that it exists to spread the rule of law and democracy, and that importantly, it exists to spread the church, the true church, the church that Christ founded in the 16th century through Henry VIII, which was the notion of Anglicanism popular at the end of the 19th century. Now, I wonder whether a post-Biden America, which certainly uses the terminology of religion in order to justify its direction increasingly, whether this will allow for a kind of, I don't know, perhaps spiritual renewal is not quite what I'm looking for, but at least we've become very, very used to just ongoing ruthless persecution of Christians, for example. Stopping that would be the kind of world policing that I would be very much in favor of. I wonder whether we're going to see a kind of an acceptance of religious expression and religious commitment on the world stage, as it were, that we've grown used to privatizing all of this stuff. What do you think?
I don't know. It's actually the relation between the Trumpian internationalism and religious faith is not something I've thought about at all. So I'm going to swerve making any clear predictions on that. I mean, I know personally individuals who are now within the Trump administration for whom that is an area of deep concern. How much direct leverage any of those individuals have, I don't know. But I think that, yeah, that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just sort of flipping the idea for a moment or two. As you were talking, it struck me that, you know, with the reforming, evangelizing church ladies of 19th century imperial Britain, you could plausibly argue that Sam Power was those church ladies' last hurrah.
Right, interesting.
I think that's a paper which I'll write when I have the time, but I think I can make that case. And what comes, but what comes now in the aftermath of that, and in the aftermath of that sort of religiously inflected international political internationalism, I'm not completely sure. I hope it's a fairly subdued. If we're back in great power competition, I just hope it stays reasonably subdued. That's my fondest hope. So
I feel like the conversation has been quite masculine coded at the moment, but you're an interesting guest because of your meditations on sort of femininity and the feminine. And it seems to me that if we want to entertain the possibility of moving in the more personality-driven direction in government, the benign dictator, it seems necessary to resurrect the idea of a muse, of a kind of idealized feminine, which I think is what tempers and cultivates a person in that position, because it's not simply power and the individual, it's power and the individual and the things that influence him. And you've made a few cryptic remarks in the past about the Blessed Virgin Mary, and I was sort of wondering whether that's something that you've spent time thinking of. Are you moving towards considering more spiritual areas of femininity? Because obviously your book was perhaps on more material terms.
Of course, these are things that I think about. How any of that relates directly to a sort of a hypothetical muse of the Trumpian era, I'm not completely sure. I certainly don't see much of a prospect of the visionary appearances of the Blessed Virgin Mary over the White House anytime soon. That seems highly unlikely. In terms of my own reflections on that archetype, there was actually. I'll tell you this. I originally wanted to include a picture. I think it was a Michelangelo picture of the Virgin and Child in that book. In the chapter I was talking about, where I spoke about being and becoming a mother. I didn't in the end because there was some sort of tedious rights issue, or we just couldn't find how to pay somebody some royalties or something. So we just left the picture out in the end. But these are things that I think about. I think probably one of the cryptic remarks that you're referring to was I said something to the effect that complementarianism without Mariology is always going to be a nightmare for women, which I think pretty much sort of sums up my. Yeah, that must have been the cryptic tweet you were thinking about. That's sort of, to me, that's just fairly self-explanatory, but maybe it isn't. I don't know. If you say, men and women were created to complement one another, but then you don't also venerate the Mother of God, then those of us who are mothers are going to be terminally on the back foot. That seems pretty clear to me. One of the things I find most frustrating about the Anglican faith, as it's generally practiced, is that they just have such a terminal blind spot on this. Even in churches which are called St. Mary, it somehow seems to be not given much space, and I don't really understand why. There's probably a religious history reason why that is, but I don't know it.
When the guy who starts your church went through a whole harem of women to sort of satisfy his the needs of his future progeny, it's not surprising that you don't know how to deal with the issue of the feminine.
Yeah, it could be that. This is I'm not really qualified to comment there. I'm on sort of sensitive terrain here because I stay kind of fairly, on denominational stuff. I try and be kind of as ecumenical as I can, wherever I can.
This is Brian trying to demonstrate how ecumenical he can be. Well,
if that's your I shudder to think of your sectarianism.